Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be with you again this morning. Wow, I love that song. That was beautiful. You know, as Unitarian Universalists, we are very proud that we choose many sources for our inspiration, including wonderful music and including the Hebrew scriptures, the Jewish teachings, the poems, the songs, and the mythical stories of the Hebrew scriptures. So this spring, I'm asking us each to remember the Passover story that is part of that wisdom tradition, the myth that reminds us what it is to struggle for freedom. This evening, as a matter of fact, will be the end of the Passover season, where a time when families and friends gather for what's known as the Seder meal. I'm hoping that some of you were able to experience that even in the midst of this pandemic situation that we're in, because it is such a beautiful tradition, a ritual meal that has a beautiful ambiance about it of welcome and openness that that expresses what the song was just about. The focal point of the Seder meal is the Haggadah, which is the story of the mythical story of the Exodus out of Egypt by the Israelites. It's not, the Haggadah doesn't talk about the entire Exodus experience, but it focuses mostly on that particular moment of the last of the plagues that cover the land of Egypt just before the Israelites escape. It is a plague of sickness, which kills the firstborn in each household. And the Israelites have been asked to have each household slaughter a lamb and smear the blood on their doorposts or lintels as a clue that their particular house needs to be passed by as the angel of death goes through the land there. Now notice that I call this a mythical story. We sometimes discount myths as something that's not factually true, but I tend to think of myths as something that is deeply true. I'm thinking in terms of the way that Krista Tippett, who is the hostess for an NPR program called On Being, when she describes myth as being something that didn't happen once, but represents something that happens over and over and over. And so myths represent a collective wisdom. And when we tell these stories and retell these stories, we do it not because they're factual necessarily, but because they bring us back to some deep truth about what it means to be human. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Passover story, the Exodus story, is that God says to Moses, and then Moses repeats this to the people several times, that all this is happening so that you shall tell the story. All this is happening so you will tell the story. Now, if this story were actually factual, that statement might sound kind of backwards, right? It's not saying that the story happens and then people tell it. It's saying that the story happened or was created in order that the people might tell it, in order to inspire, generations and generations of people to remember what it means to be free, what it takes to become free, and what it means to reclaim freedom. So this morning, I'm going to honor Passover by retelling parts of that mythical story. I want us to think about it in its mythical context as being something that is deeply true about the human condition. And so I begin by asking the question, what does it mean to be free? What does it mean to be free? Living in a free society as we do, we often imagine that the ability to do as we please, to say what we please, to live as we please, that this is the crux of what it means to be a free people. And often as Americans, when we hear the word slave, or we think about unfreedom, the unfreedom of being a slave, we think of the American experience of slavery. We think of Africans being forcibly brought here in chains. We think of men, women, and children being owned and bought and sold and chased if they try to escape. And since this is the American experience of slavery, it's not surprising that we think of freedom as being able to move about freely. But as I tell this story, it's important to remember that the slavery that of the Israelites in Egypt was not of this sort, because the Israelites had actually voluntarily migrated to Egypt during a year when there was famine in their land, in their native country. They left that land that had been promised to their ancestor Abraham. And so they were more similar to migrant workers that never went home again than to the slaves that we think of in this country. So now think about this. Think about them as migrant workers and the Pharaoh as a corporation that understands the importance of the Israelites to their economy, but he also sees them as a menace, as does the rest of the Egyptian elite. So they're kind of torn about how to handle their immigration policy, right? They need them, and yet they see them as a menace. They are described as people who have tried to assimilate, but they've been held down over and over again by the Egyptians, who see themselves as supreme in culture and in other ways as well. The Israelites are described also as people who lack distinction. They have no culture. And over decades and decades of living in Egypt, being fed, clothed, and housed, but not paid by the Egyptians, we are told that the Israelites have become reduced to non-thinking, unmotivated people. So this is their condition as the story begins to unfold. And this unmotivation becomes a problem for the Egyptians, so much so that that Pharaoh decides that the best way to maintain the supremacy of Egyptian culture without being tainted by the Israelites is to begin throwing the Israeli babies into the river. And out of this situation then comes this central figure of Moses. The man Moses, who grows up with this double consciousness of having been raised in the Pharaoh's house, but he's of Israelite descent. And it's out of this double consciousness that Moses is able to see both the extraordinary wealth and culture and supremacy of the Egyptians, but also the condition that the Israelites have fallen into. And for several chapters, Moses struggles with this knowledge. His own inner wisdom or his conversations with God, depending on your theology, move him to consider what he should do about this. And we see him constantly refusing to take on this mission to help his people, the Israelites. First, he argues that he's not worthy of being a leader of these people. And then he argues that the people are not going to listen to him anyway, so why should he even try to talk to them? And then he says that, well, the people, even if he talks to them and they listen, they're not going to believe that there is a better life elsewhere, that there is this promised land that they once left that no one remembers anymore. And then finally, Moses says to God, are these people even redeemable? Can they learn how to be free again? And I believe that it is in that question, that's the real story of Passover. Are they capable of governing themselves, of taking care of themselves and taking care of one another, of redeveloping a cultural identity? Are they redeemable? So the Exodus story is not so much a story about a cruel, persecuting Pharaoh and his victims, as it is of a people who need to somehow arouse within themselves the capacity to be redeemed, to reclaim what was once theirs. They have to open themselves up to being in relationship with one another again, as brothers and sisters, and not slaves, and to take pride in themselves again, and to believe that there is a land that was once promised to them that they can reclaim. They have to have a new kind of self-awareness to do this in order to want to emerge out of this death trap that they're in, this Egypt. And so they begin to taste that freedom that Moses talks about, and they begin to rally. And the plague passes over the Israelites' houses as the firstborns of the Egyptians begin to die. There is chaos and fear and confusion. You could only imagine that the Egyptian elites, in all their wealth, are the ones that are seeing the death of their children. And so somehow they blame the Israelites because they don't see any of this happening in those families. And they become fearful of them. And so they chase them from their homes. It's utter madness. And then they realize that they actually need them. And so they send armies to chase after them. But the Israelites go, wondering as they leave their homes what it means to be free. They have no idea where they're going. They leave without food, with only the clothes on their backs, with no possessions, carrying their children. following a man who says he has a vision of a promised land, but he's making no guarantees that they will ever find it. Because they had been in Egypt long enough that none of them had ever experienced being free. But listening to Moses, they began to believe in themselves again. And that belief became a hunger that they couldn't ignore. And so they kept walking into that wilderness of not knowing. They wander for 40 years, 40 years. Even though if you look on the map as to see where they went, you can see that they could have made it in a few months. But the 40 years is a mythical time that spans one generation. They wander until what it meant to be a slave in Egypt has been forgotten, until all they know is being on this journey together with one another, building a new identity with new covenants and new ways of belonging to each other, and a new vision of what it means to be a free people. Now, of course, along the way, they whined and they complained, especially those first few years when they remembered what it was like being a slave in Egypt. And they had things like leavened bread and other foods to eat and a place to lay their head at night. And of course, some mutinied and rebelled and focused on their own discomfort instead of the needs of the community. And when traveling got especially fearful, they melted down all their gold and they made a statue that they felt would keep them safe. But in the end, they kept walking forward because the idea of being a people of substance, capable of being free, had been planted in their hearts, and that made what they left behind inconsequential. So we have now passed the 1-year anniversary of the COVID-19 shutdown that began last March. And there has been something about this past year that has felt deeply mythical to me. We too have waited for a plague to pass our houses. And while the Israelites were asked to make haste to leave, we were asked to make haste to stay at home. But in both cases, the story required that we forget business as usual and that we leave our lives as we've known them behind. This past year has given us some unique opportunities to reflect on who we are as a people and how we want to be shaped by this experience as we continue on this journey into the unknown. And in particular, we have struggled mightily to consider what it means to be a free country. And as we do that we can recognize that the Exodus story is not a new story. That struggle is not a new story. The wilderness that we are currently in of unknowing has brought a lot of fear. It's brought pain and loss. And a lot of that masquerades as manipulation and complaining and hatred, rebellion, even mutiny. And everywhere, cheap idols are being created that we imagine will keep us safe. I was thinking about that, a few weeks ago when we saw a golden statue of Trump created for the Conservative Political Action Conference. I thought of the Israelites and their melting down of their jewelry in an especially anxious moment. Melted all their jewelry down to create a golden calf to keep them safe. We are indeed, my friends, living in a mythical moment. What does it mean to be free? Along with the joy of freedom, there's also the fear of the unknown, always. And yet, to be truly free, doesn't there also need to be some trust in the journey? Doesn't there need to be some trust that we're people who are worthy of the moment that we find ourselves in, that we are worthy and capable of being free, of earning our freedom, of reclaiming our freedom, that we are in fact redeemable. Parker Palmer wrote years ago, if American democracy fails, the ultimate cause will not be a foreign invasion or the power of big money or the greed and dishonesty of some elected officials or a military coup or the internal communist, socialist, fascist takeover that keeps some Americans awake at night. It will happen because we, you and I, become so fearful of one another, of our differences and our future, that we unraveled the civic community on which democracy depends, losing our power to resist all that threatens it and call it back to its highest form. End quote. So the question before us now is, are we redeemable? Are we willing to enter into that struggle of remaining free? As we continue the journey together, this wilderness journey into the unknown, let us remember that the promised land is not a destination. It is not even promised. It is instead a way of going. That country of freedom and dignity, you carry it with you and you reclaim it every time you make the choice to stand up and move forward toward it, walking forward through all the hate and the bigotry and the injustices that may shock us, but that often also tell us that we are in fact on the right path. So, my friends, as we cross the threshold of each new day, may we find the strength and the courage of knowing that we are on the right path and that we are moving forward together. May it be so. Amen. And blessed be.